The tale of the Radium Girls is a very dark and heavy subject. It contains a plethora of trigger warnings, such as death, corpse mutilation, bad company practices, and medical issues containing the bones and skin of the women and people who were affected. If you are unable to stomach it at this time, feel free to come back. It's okay. Take time for yourself, lovelies. Get some water, as always. Now, let us begin with the tale of the Radium Girls. It is the year 1896 when Henry Becquerel discovers the concept of radiation, which later leads to the discovery of radium in 1902 on April 20th by one Marie and Pierre Curie. They will later win a Nobel Peace Prize for their work with radium. Now, at this time in history, radium is seen as a miracle cure. It's attacking of some cells. It proves great for cancer treatment and cosmetics to give people a youthful glow. Now, they did know that it was dangerous, but only in large amounts. Pierre Curie did say that he would never be in a room with a copious amount of radium because it would cause damage to the eyes and skin. However, because it was limited knowledge to the scientist, we come to the issue of the Radium Girls. Now, a few years later, in 1915, Dr. Sabine von Schocke creates the paint Undark using radium. Now, Undark glows in the dark, and they were having an issue because it was about the start of World War I, where in the trenches, people needed to know the time for certain things, except to do this, they would light a match, and that could potentially give away their position. So, Dr. Sabine created Undark, which was a glow-in-the-dark paint, so they wouldn't have to use matches anymore. This created a boom for the watch factories like the United States Radium Corporation and Radium Dial. And these are the two main ones I will be talking about today. There was a bunch of others, but these are the two main well-known ones. Both companies kind of started in 1917, and at this point, the late 1910s, early 1920s, and especially in the 1920s, radium was a very hot commodity. It was put into everything. It was put into spas, in butter, in cosmetics, in cancer treatments, and it was everywhere. You could not go somewhere without seeing radium. Now, in the time period, the radium companies needed dial painters, and it was a very sought-after job because it both paid well and you got to work with this miracle cure for free, basically. It was also highly sought after because they weren't in a dark, dingy basement for manufacturing. They were actually in a well-lit studio with big windows, and it was more casual. A lot of these girls would wear their best dresses because the radium would make their clothes glow. So after work, they'd go to dance halls and be very pretty and have a nice youthful glow to them. Now, because it was such a highly sought-after job, a lot of these girls did lie about their age. The youngest radium girl we can confirm was about 11 years old, but most of them, when they start working, will be around 14, 15 years old and a little bit older. Now, these girls, a lot of the time, would have fun with the leftover paint. This was more common in the Radium Dial company because they were a little bit more liberal with their paint. In the USRC, they were more conservative because it was a more expensive mixture of Undark. So they were more conscious about how much they were using. but a lot of these girls would paint their nails in the radium paint, paint their teeth to give it a nice glow, and just have fun and draw mustaches on each other. Because they were teenagers. They were young women, and they were just having fun, which I don't blame them for that. Now, how they painted the dials was interesting because it led to a lot of the issues later down the line that I'll discuss here in a second. But to point the brushes, because they were camel hair, and a lot of the time, if any of you have ever painted something, the bristles of the brush tend to fray out and they lose their point. So they'd dip the paintbrush in water to clean off whatever radium they could, and then they'd take it into their mouth, and as they spun it out, they'd press it with their lips to create a fine point, and this was dubbed the lip pointing method. Now, to get to the nitty-gritty of the matter. To preface, I do want to make clear that at this time, radium was still considered a miracle cure. A lot of people did not know about the harmful side effects, except for the scientific community and Dr. Sabine himself. There was multiple occasions in the scientist community where stuff just happened. For example, Dr. Sabine got a little bit of radium, pure radium, under his nail, and the pain was immense, and he basically took off his own fingertip because the pain was so bad. Later down the line, he saw one of the girls performing the lip pointing method, and he looked at her, and he said, "Don't do that, or you'll be very sick." So, concerned, a lot of these girls went to their higher-ups and asked if radium was dangerous. And the higher-ups basically said, it's a treatment. Of course it's not dangerous. And that would lead to several complications later down the line. The first victim of the radium paint was one Molly Maggia. She started with a toothache, so she went to her dentist and got the tooth pulled. However, it didn't get better. In fact, it got worse. So she tried a different doctor, and he was concerned because he thought maybe it was phossy jaw. And phossy jaw is caused by phosphorus. So he inquired with the USRC if they used phosphorus in their paint. And because it was a trade secret for the company, they did not give him the full recipe, but they did confirm that they did not use phosphorus in their paint. And after hearing this, the doctor was starting to get an idea of what it could be that was causing Molly such pain. Now, unfortunately, Molly did pass away in 1922, and the cause of her death that the doctor suggested was syphilis. Now, it's the 1920s. There's a lot of stigma around having syphilis, and we know it's not true that she had syphilis. She died of radium poisoning because her friends, her coworkers, knew her, and they knew that she wasn't really the party girl. She went to dances, yes, but she was more with her friends. She wasn't really into that type of scene. Now, Molly Maggia's death spurs on multiple coming forwards for the Radium girls. A lot of these girls thought it was very cool how they glowed, and a lot of people called them the ghost girls to kind of insinuate the glow that they gave off. And in a few months, the companies start to inquire. The USRC comes to a couple by the name of Dr. Cecil and Catherine Drinker, and they ask to give a report on radium. And of course, the couple finds that these women are being poisoned by radium because radium is very close to calcium, and around 20% of the time, the body will confuse it for calcium and will go into the bones. That's why a lot of these women had glowing bones. They could see their bones through their skin. And of course, one would think that the company would care about their workers and post the report. However, Instead, they created another report detailing the benefits of radium and saying it was perfectly safe, and they published it under the drinker name and then proceeded to bully the drinkers not to publish their report. The drinkers agreed to not publish their report because they would be assuming that the company would eventually post it and make the proper changes to their methods. However, they never did. And in 1925, Grace Flyer would start falling apart. She was having issues with her spine, and a lot of these girls, you would just touch their jaw and it would fall off. Pieces would just come away from the skeleton. And Grace was having issues with her spine, and she needed a brace to help her stand, help walk. And a few months later, the USRC would hire Frederick Flynn, and he would basically review a lot of the girls and give them a clean bill of health, saying, once again, that radium was a treatment, not a poison. However, there was one slight issue. You see, Frederick Flynn was not actually a doctor. He was a philosopher, and he was being paid by the corporation to lie on a lot of these medical examinations. But the girls are persistent to figure out what is wrong with them. So, contacting a doctor by the name of Harrison Mortland, they beg him to discover the truth. So, he does. He discovers the fact that the girl's body, even after they pass away, still glows and has a lot of radium, and he's noticing a lot of the bones look very moth-eaten. So after Grace Flyer gathers a ton of evidence, herself and Quinta MacDonald, Edna Hussman, Albina Larice, Catherine Schaub, and their lawyer sue the company in 1927. But of course, their fight takes longer. The company takes a really quick vacation to Europe to try to prolong the trial so that they don't have to pay these ladies. They are trying to reach a point where these ladies have already passed on, so they don't have to worry about court trials and the whatnot. They managed to get the help of Elizabeth Hughes, who created the electroscope, and hers measured the gamma rays coming off of something. However, the company, after hiring her and still asking her help after she left the company, discredited her because she was a married woman without a job. And they managed to extend this trial for 2 whole years. Now, at this time in history, a lot of the girls have deteriorated so much that they cannot lift their arms to take the oath. So they have to settle out of court in 1929 because they were settled with medical debt. So with the help of Raymond Barry, their lawyer, they managed to get something. It was only a fraction of the money that they sought, but at least it paid their medical bills, and they would be granted at the time $600 per year. Unfortunately, the company would not pay a lot of the required money because, unfortunately, all 5 of these women would be dead a year later. Now, we are going to move from the United States Radium Company set in New Jersey, and we're going to go to Ottawa, Illinois, to see how things went off with the Radium Dial Company. Now, we are going to go back here to 1929, when one Margaret Looney has passed away due to radium poisoning. Now, her family's home one night, and they get a knock on their door, and they see a bunch of company men wanting to take their daughter's body to go bury it. Her brother steps up and demands that they just leave the body alone, because why is the company so worried about that? the company then agrees to have an autopsy, and then the family requests that their family doctor be present for the autopsy. Now, here's the thing. For the date of the autopsy, when the family doctor got there, they were already done with the autopsy, and some of her bones were missing. There was a lot of hiding of what was actually happening to these girls after they passed. And they were also trying to cover the fact up that a lot of the people around the girls were starting to have issues as well, because when you're in close proximity to radium, it is radioactive. And so by proximity, a lot of these girls' families would get sick because they're around the radiation given off by the girls themselves. Now, in 1934, Mary Curie dies due to her radium exposure. The same year, Joseph Kelly is ousted from Radium Dial and starts Luminous Processes. Radium Dial does end up getting sued in 1935 by Ines Valade. However, she does unfortunately lose her first case. However, in 1937, she tries again with the help of 5 other women, with the help of Leonard Grossman. And they thankfully win this case in 1938. Unfortunately, it didn't end up as well. They got the best that they could, but it was still not enough for how much medical bills they ended up procuring over the course of their unfortunately very short lives. Now, this leads us to May Keene, who thankfully only worked a few days in the factory, and she ended up living to 107, and she died in 2014. However, she did not escape the issues that the other girls experienced. She just experienced them to a lesser degree. She still had issues with cancer and a lot of her bones. Now, these companies did know the dangers of radium. In fact, they were giving protective gear to a lot of the people who made the paint. A lot of companies were giving lead suits to the people who made the paint because they knew it was dangerous. However, for these girls, they were eating the paint, basically, with the lip pointing method. In Radium Dial, there was a rumor that one of the supervisors, when training the girls, took the paint on a spatula and ate it to show the girls that it was completely safe. However, now we know that's not the case. Now, this trial was a long and painfully agonizing trial for these girls. The company, Radium Dial, went back and forth and weaved their words in such a way where they basically played the rules of the law. In the first trial, they said radium was a poison because radium poison was not under the workman's comp laws. And then the next trial, they said that it was completely safe because it was finally somewhat added. Now, unfortunately, the law couldn't really go after a lot of these companies who moved to different states or simply changed their names because the lawsuits were tied to certain names. Now, thankfully, these lawsuits did help a lot of the other painters by providing them more protections when painting dials. A lot of the lip pointing methods were no longer used, and it gave us more insight on the dangers of radium because, unfortunately, the companies did not care about these people. They only cared about losing money. Now, thankfully, in the 70s, they stopped using radium paint. And in 1976, Luminous Processes thankfully did shut down. But that's not the end of the story just quite yet. In 1980, the United States Radium Corporation did change its name to Safety Light Corporation. And Safety Light Corporation closed in 2007. I find it so wild that a lot of these companies closed down multiple decades after these lawsuits. The companies fought tooth and nail to not take responsibility. They used a lot of people like Frederick Flynn to pretend to be doctors. But thankfully, there was people like Dr. Cecil Drinker who saw that his report was not actually published and published it a few years later, trying to draw attention to these girls. Now, unfortunately, a lot of these girls were ostracized by their community because people thought they were lying and trying to harm a good company and a good way to make money for yourself. And a lot of these companies were saying these girls were having diphtheria or misophonia, and there was a statement given out by these companies that basically said, "We unfortunately gave work to a great many people who were physically unfit to procure employment in other lines of industry. Cripples and persons similarly incapacitated were engaged. What was then considered an act of kindness on our part has since been turned against us." That was said by the USRC president post-trial. Now, thankfully, a lot of change was created by these trials. We now have OSHA, thanks to this, and we also have a better definition for workman's compensation. My thoughts on this is it did end up helping people in the end, but unfortunately, because the company and companies did not care about their workers, we lost so many women. And with them consuming so much radium, they painted about 200 clocks a day, and sometimes even 250. And then eventually later down the line, because demand was so high, and after the First World War, they cut their production in half, they went to a 7-day work week. And sometimes these companies would have these girls repoint the brush after every stroke or every number, and they were consuming radium hundreds, thousands times per day. And it angers me that instead of taking accountability for their actions and paying these girls so their families weren't settled with a huge amount of medical debt, they decided to twist the law to their advantage and pay people to fake information to just avoid paying these girls. And then to further discredit one of your past employees who you still use as reference later down the line. It reads as so sexist because a lot of this attention to these girls was first brought on by men having the same issues, just to a lighter degree, because they weren't consuming as much paint. And thankfully, these girls, and eventually when they grew up to be young women, fought hard because they weren't only concerned about themselves, they were concerned about their families, and they were concerned about their coworkers who, after seeing your coworkers literally disintegrate before you, it is a horrifying notion that there is no cure. There was, in one of the trials, somebody asked if there was a cure. And of course, unfortunately for radiation poisoning, there is none. In fact, their graves still emit radiation. It was a slow and agonizing end for a lot of these girls. But of course, they had an immense strength to them because they knew if they just rolled over and didn't say anything, that it would continue to happen. So they said no more. And I fully support how hard they fought against these companies who did not care about them. They only cared about the bottom line. These girls who thought that they had a great job because it paid so well and they were making so much more money than a lot of other professions, They thought it was good, and they thought that the radium that they were consuming was helping with their health, when in reality, it was destroying them from the inside out. And radium not only caused their bones to be very brittle, it also shortened them. One of the girls' legs was 4 inches shorter than the other one. And it just appalls me to know how long and how hard these women had to fight just so the community and these companies could acknowledge that they poisoned them. And unfortunately, it doesn't really end with the Radium Girls. There's so many companies who participate in malpractice, and we see it in the news so often that company so-and-so did somewhat, and they were lobbying the law so that they themselves could continue to make more money on the cheaper end. But unfortunately, a lot of the times when we remove the protections that protect people from getting sick or getting hurt, it affects people. Yes, the cheaper cost of manufacturing something does increase the profit, but can we really compare that to the cost of a human life? I'm going to say no. We should all care about each other, and we can all agree that community and being there for one another and making sure that everyone is safe is so much greater and holds so much more value than a piece of paper with some gold behind it. Thankfully, the government did listen to these girls, and after their tragic tale and story and trials, they did help implement laws into place to make sure a tragedy at this scale would never happen again. I find myself wondering if these girls had the proper protections in place and there was more research done in terms of what radium did to the human body, and it was actually expanded on, I wonder what these women would have done. Most of these women never saw 50, they never saw 60, they never saw the world progress to where it was. And even in their last years, they were in so much pain. Like, for example, Grace Flyer could only be out of her spine brace 2 minutes every day, otherwise it would cause more damage. And unfortunately, it wasn't a very soft end. It was very hard on a lot of these women. And unfortunately, if you're hoping for a happy ending where the bad guy gets justice, I'm sorry to say, but it's not going to happen. These companies, unfortunately, never got their just dues. They fought against these girls to make sure they didn't have to pay a single penny for them. And all I can say to every person who ignored these girls and fought to make sure that they suffered and didn't have any of their medical bills paid, I hope that every single night, both sides of the pillow were not cool and they burned with the fire of these girls' feminine rage. I pray that the guilt from these women's passings ate them very much alive. And that was the story of the Radium Girls.